Hello and welcome to another video. This time I want to give you a couple of quick tips how to make the best out of your ambiences in your game. I'm using Unreal Engine 5 for that, but this is applicable to pretty much any game engine. So my first tip would be to not just use one loop for the whole ambience, because over time you will notice how specific patterns in the ambience repeat because, well, they just loop. And if you have multiple loops that also have a different length, they will overlap at different points because they run asynchronously. And that's a very easy technique to create a little bit of perceived randomization without actually randomizing anything. By the way, another quick tip when we're here in Unreal in the Metasounds and we want to tweak the volume of these different loops, we can just drag this pin out for one of those and promote to graph input. And then we have a volume knob for that specific loop here and another one. And then you can, tweak these while you're listening to everything. My next tip would be to randomize the start time of these loops. So as you can see, I've added some random time nodes here. And every time this whole ambience is loaded, so basically when you enter an environment, each loop will always start at a different point. Whenever you an environment and loop always starts the same, it will feel a bit unnatural, and we don't want that. We want to make it feel as natural as possible, and the best way to do that is to have as much randomization as we can get. My next tip would be to not just rely on these loops though, but instead have something very random and generative going alongside that complements these loops. What I did here is I actually loaded another Metasound in here, which is the bird patterns Metasound that I talked about in another tutorial. If we double click, we can see this here, and this will always generate me some random bird patterns. You can see this will be played after a random time, like 5 to 10 seconds, and then will loop. By the way, you can load other Metasounds into a Metasound by just clicking somewhere or dragging a pin out here and then typing in the name of the Metasound you want to have, and it will be here. And it's a really practical way of keeping things tidy by encapsulating them into different Metasounds and then loading them into one main Metasound. So for instance, I could also, if I want to get really crazy, have multiple generative Metasounds in one big Metasound. But actually, I think you don't need much more than that. This is already a setup that will sound pretty unpredictable to the listener. So as a starting point, I would just play the game now a bit and pay attention if I notice anything that's repeating and that breaks the immersion for me, and then judge what the next steps could be and if I need to add more randomization. Because more isn't always better. The bigger the Metasound gets, the more each environment needs to load, and it will cost performance, and it will also cost production time and money, so be aware of that. Another thing you can generate in Unreal other than patterns with samples is actually generating audio. And that's one of the cool things about Metasounds. You don't just have to rely on samples or anything pre-recorded in your DAW, but you can actually generate sounds in Metasounds. And there can be synthetic stuff with oscillators. What I'm doing here is building my own noise generator. And the way this works is that I'm defining a frequency range of that noise, and then I filter that noise and have it filtered in a resonant way so it sounds like wind. And this is exactly what I'm using this for. As you can hear, this always sounds a little bit different. That's because these values here for the noise are randomized, but it also has to do with this envelope here, which is another cool thing you can do in Metasounds. So every time this plays back, it has a different attack or decay value, and it will always fade in and fade out in different ways, combined with some stereo panning that goes on all the time with an LFO. This creates a very interesting wind effect that is stereo and that just keeps evolving and never quite sounds the same. And that's actually something I used in a very similar way in Oddsparks for the cold biome. I used that as one of the Metasounds within a bigger Metasound. So one thing you may have noticed is that there's not just one noise generator, but multiple generators that act within specific frequency ranges. And there's also a noise generator that isn't really swelling, but has a more consistent sound. Generally, I think this is a really cool and practical method, especially with wind. It's sometimes difficult to find or record nice samples that you can then also randomize in nice ways that come together nicely. So this is a very nice alternative you can consider. One final thing I would like to recommend is to not just rely on one Metasound to handle it all. So as I showed you in this video, you can get really deep with Metasounds and create lots of randomization, but it will never have an interactive element to it. That's because within Unreal, this is just a 2D sound source. So what I mean by that is it is stereo, but it is not a distinct sound source in your environment. And for an ambience that really sounds immersive and alive, we need both. So on one hand, the actual ambience, which is a 2D sound source and does random things no matter if or how you move, and individual sound sources in your environment that change volume depending on your distance to them, or change panning depending on if you're left or right to them, or change frequencies depending on whether there's an object between you and the sound source. And there are multiple ways how you can go about this. One way is just looking at what the game design demands. So for instance, in Oddsparks, we have all these workstations that should give the player feedback whether or not they are producing something. So we would definitely need sound for that. And also the animations indicate that we should do something sound-wise here. And through all these producing workstations, we get lots of sound sources in the environment that make the ambience much more alive. In this case, we would attach the sound to the individual actors in the game and make the sound of them play or not, depending on whether they produce something or not. Another approach could be to look at the environment and consider what kind of sounds would make sense in specific areas. In Oddsparks, most of the environment is procedurally generated, but we also have one environment that always stays the same, the village, which is basically the main hub of the game, and which is where I was able to place some fixed sound sources. Some things were again dictated by animations, for example, the wooden crate hanging on a rope at the quartermaster, or the telescope on the roof of the Divine Researcher, or the hammering close to the Mason sisters. These are just attached to the individual actors as fixed audio sound sources. This doesn't require any game-specific code. You can just click Add here and select Audio. And then you just have to select the sound you want in the menu here. But for this to work, you also need to assign attenuation values or attenuation presets to the individual sound. Otherwise, they will not be recognized as a 3D sound. In the attenuation settings, we can define how the sound behaves depending on distance to the object and how they affect volume and panning. But then I also added sound sources for corners of the village where there was no actor or animation yet. For these, I created actors that are invisible and only contain the audio trigger. Here, for example, cricket sounds near the water, or a waterfall sound at the bridge. And by the way, if you want your actor to be invisible, it just shouldn't have any static mesh in here. So I could just remove this, compile, and then we have no visible actor, but we remain the audio functionality. Or we can also just remove the sphere here. Or just don't add any visual reference in the first place when creating Blueprint Actor, which you can do, by the way, by clicking Add, Blueprint Class, Actor. And here we just make sure that we don't add anything visual, just the audio element like I showed before. And if we drag this into the map, you can see in this preview, we still have a visual reference. We can see how this is placed in the environment, but when we enter the scene, we don't see anything, we only hear. And for the procedurally generated areas of Oddsparks, I just attached the sound to types of actors that were randomly spawned in different locations. Alright, that's it for this video. If you think I missed something, let me know in the comments.